Greetings friends, and welcome to my scary little production. After making the video 6 creepy house stories, it has become so popular that I've decided to offer a terrifying sequel. This time we will hear 3 more stories, even creepier, about some of the worst houses on the proverbial block. These edifices of evil want you dead, or those who live with you. They harbor unspeakable terrors that haunt your dreams. They even come to snatch you from your bed. So gather round, dim your lights if you dare. I suggest you get your favorite hot or cold drink, and get ready for an evening about 3 creepy houses. In our inaugural tale tonight, none other than Dr. Creepin Van Paster brings to life a chilling account of how a peaceful house can hide a very sinister evil. Check for any tapping at your windows and lock them fast as we listen to the house down by the creek.
Just before Christmas, when I was 10 years old, we moved into a new house. Not just new to us, but new. There was still plastic on the carpeting the day we moved in, and instead of a lawn or garden in the backyard, we just had plain, soft dirt. In my mind, it was the best Christmas present ever. Having grown up in the tightly packed suburbs of Southern California, living on a street with only 3 other houses on it was pretty awesome. One of those houses wasn't even completely built yet, and instead of across-the-street neighbors, there was an honest-to-God creek with rushing water and everything. The house itself was pretty cool too. My baby brother and I each got our own rooms, with locking doors even. The living room had more windows than it did plain walls, and in the bottom of my parents' closet was the little trap door that led to a crawl space beneath the house. Plus, our new next-door neighbors had a girl just a year older than me. I'd been friends with all of the kids on our old street, so I knew we were going to get along great. But the best thing about our new house was that I finally got my dad back. When my mum got accepted into grad school, my dad immediately began looking for a job in the area, but by the time it came for Mum to start school, he still hadn't found one. So, my mum took me and my 1-year-old brother with her to live in a tiny, cockroach-infested, 1-bedroom student housing apartment, while Dad stayed behind at our old house 400 miles away, while he continued to look for a new job. It took 3 months before he could join us, which to me seemed like a lifetime. Unfortunately, it didn't take long for the shine to wear off. My parents didn't have enough money to put in a lawn, and my dad kept finding raccoon holes dug up against the house in the backyard. I was forbidden from playing in the awesome creek after me and my parents found a bunch of empty beer bottles, a sleeping bag, and some drug paraphernalia on the bank one weekend. I wasn't allowed to play in the crawl space under the house, since my mum saw a black widow down there. I did get to play with the girl next door some, but she was the kind of friend who spent just as much time being mean to me as actually being friendly, and she absolutely hated my friends from school. Worst of all, I hardly ever saw my dad, since his new job had him working most days from before I got up for school until just before, or sometimes even after, my bedtime. He also worked a lot of weekends. I spent a lot of time in my room reading books, mostly of the creepy thriller variety. About a year after we'd moved in, my parents decided I was old enough to stay home alone after dark, and even to babysit my brother for a couple of hours every Friday night, so they could have date night. It was around that time that things started getting weird. I started hearing noises when I was home alone. At first it was just pots and dishes clanking together in the kitchen. The first time it happened, I was convinced there was someone in the house. This was before cell phones, and our only telephone was in the kitchen, so I locked my bedroom door and hid in my closet until my mum got home. When I told her what happened, she just laughed and told me I had an overactive imagination. She'd locked all of the doors and windows before leaving, so it had to be just dishes settling after they were stacked haphazardly. I took her word for it and tried not to let the little kitchen noises bother me, although I did wonder why the dishes only settled when I was home alone. Then came the muffin incident. My dad was working late one Saturday, so my mum made plans for all of us to meet him at a restaurant near his office for dinner, so we could at least see him for an hour or two. My mum, never the greatest when it came to punctuality, got home from our weekly grocery shopping only 5 minutes before we were supposed to meet my dad. She tossed the perishables in the refrigerator, still in their bags, and left everything else, including a plastic container of sugar-topped blueberry muffins, just sitting out on the counter, while she hustled me and my brother out of the door. A couple of hours later, we returned home, bellies full of delicious Mexican food. My dad had finished his project early and actually got to come home with us, so we were all in high spirits. While my mum took my brother off to change his diaper, Dad and I went into the kitchen to put away the groceries. Everything was exactly like we'd left it, except for one tiny detail. The muffin container was open, and the tops of each and every muffin were gone. My parents blamed our portly old cat, who was much more fond of human food than most cats. I came to a different conclusion. Clearly, we had a kitchen ghost. After that, I put any weird noises I heard in the house down to the kitchen ghost. There was a lot more clanking and clattering, and sometimes I even heard footsteps in the hallway. Just the ghost, I'd tell myself, and go back to reading. It wasn't until a few months later that I started to suspect that maybe the kitchen ghost wasn't exactly friendly. I started getting pelted with rocks when I was playing in the front of my house. At first I thought it must be my friend from next door hiding in the trees, since it was exactly the kind of nasty thing she'd do. Ever since I'd mentioned the ghost to her, she'd been prank calling my house to talk in creepy voices when she knew I was home alone. But she wasn't very good at disguising her voice, so I always knew it was her. But then, one day, we were both out front playing together, and the rocks started flying at us. She gave me a frightened look and ran back to her house. That was when I realized it must have been the ghost throwing those rocks. I went to the library and read up on methods of protecting myself from ghosts and evil spirits. I made a little pouch out of fabric from my mum's craft leftovers and stuffed it with salt and sage to take with me. I drew pentagrams in salt water on the walls, door and window, and hung cinnamon sticks above the door to my bedroom. When my mum asked what I was doing, I told her about the ghost. She told me I needed to stop reading so many creepy stories. The next time I was outside, I got pelted with stones. I reached into my pocket and held the little amulet I'd created tight in my fist. I turned in the direction that the stones seemed to be coming from and stared straight into the dense trees that lined the creek. "I know you're there," I called out to the ghost. "I know you're there, and you can't hurt me." I stood perfectly still, waiting. Nothing happened. I walked back to my house, secure in the protection offered to me by my tiny amulet. For a few weeks, everything was quiet. There were no more footsteps, no more clattering in the kitchen. Ha! I had beaten the ghost. Or so I thought. It was a Friday night when it happened. My parents were out on their weekly date, and I was reading in the living room while my brother played with his wooden train set on the floor. Suddenly, my brother let out a wild peal of laughter, in that way that small children do when they get really excited about something. I glanced up from my book and saw that he was staring in my direction, giving me a wide baby smile. I smiled back at him and then turned my attention back to my book. A few minutes later, he started laughing again and clapping his hands together. I set down my book and crawled over to him. "What's so funny, little goose?" I asked him. My brother raised his chubby 2-year-old arm and pointed over my shoulder. "Window man," he said excitedly. My head snapped around. Just outside our living room window was the face of a man I'd never seen before. He grinned at me. I didn't even hesitate. I grabbed my brother around his middle, dashed to the kitchen to grab our cordless phone, and locked us both in my bedroom. By this time, my brother was as freaked out as I was, and it took me a few minutes to get the 911 operator to understand what I was saying over my brother's wailing and the lump in my own throat. She assured me that a police car was on its way, and they'd knock on our front door and identify themselves when they arrived. 15 minutes later, the cops arrived. They told me they were going to search around the outside of the house. They didn't find anything, not even footprints in the soft dirt where my parents still hadn't put in a lawn. After that night, my parents didn't leave me alone at home or with my brother anymore. Due to the lack of footprints, I knew the face in the window was our ghost. But my parents were more worried that someone might have been intending to break in, even if the police didn't find any evidence of it. I was still alone most afternoons though, while my dad was at work and my mum was in class. The footsteps and other noises came back, and sometimes I heard faint whispers calling my name outside my door. The ghost hadn't gone away. He'd just gotten pissed off. I started locking the door to my bedroom whenever I was home alone. About 2 months after this incident, my parents told me that we'd be moving at the end of the school year. With Mum's tuition and textbook costs, we just couldn't afford to keep the house. I don't think I've ever been so relieved in my life. I didn't care that I'd be switching schools and moving away from all of my friends, or that we were moving back into one of those crummy student housing apartments. I was just glad to be getting out of the house. Because we were only moving about 25 minutes away, we moved our boxes in stages. My mum started taking boxes over to the apartment when she was over that way for classes, and we'd all go over on the weekends to unpack. A week before we were due to move, I got sick. I'm not talking a little sick either. I was full on unable to breathe through my nose. I was feverish and barely able to get out of bed. I went to the doctor and got antibiotics, but I was still pretty weak and muddled by the time the weekend rolled around, and wasn't up for helping my parents move things. Both my parents worried about leaving me home alone while I was so sick, but they only had the moving truck for 2 days, so they needed to get the big furniture moved immediately. I told them I'd be fine, and then curled up in a sleeping bag in my now empty bedroom to nap. I didn't know at first what had woken me up. It was dark in my bedroom except for the tiny nightlight. I wouldn't let my parents move until I did, which meant it must be night already. My parents said they'd bring me back dinner, so maybe it was them getting home. Then I heard it, a tapping on my bedroom window. At first I thought I must be imagining it, or I was hearing something else and I just thought it was at my window. I was pretty sick after all. It happened again. Definitely my window. I huddled down deeper into my sleeping bag and told myself it was nothing. Another tap. Only one this time. And then a soft voice called my name. I was fighting back tears at this point. Between my fear and being sick, I couldn't even think. I just curled myself into a ball and tried not to make any noise. All of the protections in my room had been taken down in preparation for the move, but I still had my little amulet tucked inside my nightgown. Maybe, if I pretended not to hear, the ghost would go away. It seemed like forever to my hazy mind, but eventually the tapping and calling stopped. I breathed a sigh of relief and let myself relax. I was almost asleep again when I heard the footsteps in the hallway. These weren't the faint, slow footsteps I'd heard in the past. These were heavy and quick, and they stopped just outside my bedroom door. A voice in the hallway said my name. It wasn't soft or sing-song anymore, but low and gruff. I clutched my amulet and prayed for the ghost to go away. There was a long silence, and then came a different, even more disturbing sound. Something was trying to turn my locked doorknob. It was just a soft rattle at first, and then more vigorous. I thought about trying to pull myself out of my sleeping bag, to go hide in the closet, but I couldn't take my eyes off that rattling doorknob. Then, something hit my door, hard. It sounded almost like someone was throwing their weight against it. Then it happened again. I was full on crying at this point, unable to keep quiet. I should have gone with my parents, even though I was sick. I should have gotten up and called them at the new house as soon as I heard the tapping on the window. There was another huge bang against the door, and I heard the wood start to splinter. I was sure I was about to die. And then I heard something else. The unmistakable sound of a moving van pulling into my driveway. The banging stopped, as did the rattling of my doorknob. I heard the moving van door slam, and then the fainter sound of the door to my mother's car shutting. Heavy footsteps retreated down the hallway. I waited until I heard my parents inside calling me before I got up to unlock my door. Of course, they were all sorts of worried when they saw my tear-stained face, but once I told them what had happened, they assumed I'd been having a fever nightmare. I was distraught enough, though, and they agreed we could go sleep in the new apartment that night. I didn't even want to stay long enough to eat the pizza they'd brought me, so insisted on eating it in the car. I never, ever went back to that house down by the creek. When I was 11 years old, I was terrified because I thought I was sharing my house with a ghost. Looking back on it as an adult, I remember that trapdoor in my parents' room that led beneath the house. I remember the raccoon holes in the backyard, and the tattered sleeping bag and drug paraphernalia we found by the creek. So, I still keep my blinds pulled at night, double-check the locks on my doors whenever I'm alone, and I try very hard not to think about what could have happened if my parents hadn't come home when they did.
Scared yet? Dr. Creepin, with his slow, sonorous tones, can do just that. And we've only begun our night of fear. And I fear you need a break. Fill your mug. Keep those lights off. In moments, Unit 522 tells us about a house that makes the one down by the creek appear tame by comparison.
I grew up in Keeling, Missouri. No, you wouldn't have heard of it. It was a small, rural, upper-middle-class community where everyone owned at least an acre or two. My father was a writer, and my mom wanted to keep horses, so this was the perfect one-stoplight town to settle in. I grew up there until suddenly in 1984, the government claimed eminent domain on all of Keeling, and we were bought out. My dad then moved us to sunny California. I'm a writer too, though I'm not as well known as my father is. I write informational pieces for online magazines and blogs. As you can probably guess, I'm barely getting by. So when one of my editors asked me to write an article on eminent domain for a well-known political website, I jumped at the chance. She told me I was chosen because I had first-hand experience with eminent domain, and the buyer wanted a personal piece that included photos. I packed my bags that night, excited for the project. I'd always been curious about what became of my hometown. Anyway, before he died, my dad told me he thought Keeling had been turned into an airport. First, research. I was disappointed to find out that the internet was all but mute on the old town. Citing my sources was going to be difficult. I knew Keeling had been near Poplar Bluff, Missouri, so I pulled up Google Earth and followed 67 north to the turnoff for Keeling. Odd. The entire town was blank. Blank like there was a black gaping hole where Keeling used to be, a hole in the satellite data. I slammed my laptop shut and threw the mouse against the wall. This could only mean one thing. It was private and likely secret government property now. I hemmed and hawed on it for a few days before deciding to go anyway. This particular buyer had allowed me a per diem, funds for travel, and I might as well use them. Maybe there was still a story here. 2 days later, I was driving through Poplar Bluff in a rented Ford Focus. I stopped at a gas station for some water and granola bars, deciding to check into the hotel after I got back from Keeling. I was looking forward to seeing it again. I took the exit north on 67 and drove until I realized I had missed the turnoff. I circled back, looking for anything familiar. I drove back and forth until I found it. Barely there, covered in plant life and completely unrecognizable, was a road. I'd seen this street a million times, but never unpaved, which is why I had missed it. Someone had pulled up the asphalt and the road was completely overgrown. Bizarre. I drove the 6 miles into Keeling, wishing I had rented something with bigger tires and a higher clearance. Suddenly the pavement returned, and I rolled back into the abandoned business district of Keeling. It was small. A post office, a gas station, and a bar. All the buildings were derelict and rotting. Their decay far more consistent with something left sitting there for 100 years, not 30. I drove through the eerily quiet town with the burnt-out stoplight and continued down Route 51 towards my old house. As I passed the other houses on the street, I noticed they were in the same state of advanced decay as those in town. It was unsettling. Pulling up to the house I had lived in only 30 years before to find it crumbling and consumed by time. I went through every room in my old house for the nostalgia, but found nothing of interest. We had packed well. There was nothing left but a mannequin covered by a bedsheet in my mom's old sewing room. I was glad she left that. Those things were creepy. I left my old house and continued down the road, which by now had turned back in the dirt. Just why had the government bought this place? Why spend all that money, buy up all this land, and then abandon it? My stomach fell as I started to realize there may be no story here. I was going to return to LA empty-handed. I swore audibly. I counted house after house, knowing I was reaching the end of the street. All were in varied states of decomposition. Some had even collapsed on themselves. The house at the end of the drive began coming into view. I slowed down to take it in, as it filled my windshield. I never remembered this house being this big, but then again, my parents hadn't let me go this far down the street. While every other building in Keeling was disintegrating rapidly, this house stood proud and palatial, untouched by the decades. It was almost as if this place was stealing the energy, life even, of every other building in town, and maybe even more than that. A large, very clear and defined area of dead grass circled the house. 2 dead trees stood skeletized within its radius. Maybe it was toxic groundwater. The windows were all barred, except for a small circular port window on the 3rd story. If the government had claimed this town for anything, it was clearly this house. It was so different from the others, but what was so special about it? Smelling a story at last, I parked in the pristine white driveway and climbed out of my car, hauling my camera and laptop cases over my shoulder. I walked up the first 4 steps to the front door and was delighted to find it unlocked. The foyer was large and the house smelled musty. A staircase to the 2nd floor was set right in front of me. There was a floor-to-ceiling mirror on the wall to my left and a closed door and hallway beyond it to my right. I set my stuff down and took my phone out. No signal. Fantastic. Looks like I wouldn't be calling the hotel about my late arrival. I toured the house, snapping a few pictures with my cell phone as I went. The 1st floor had a library, a living room, a kitchen, and a dining room. All the furniture had been left. Even the dining room table was set. Everything was orderly and oddly dust-free. Was someone still cleaning this place? The 2nd floor had 4 bedrooms and another narrow staircase that led up to the attic. I tried the attic door first, but I found it to be locked. The first room I went into was the master bedroom. It was simple yet cozy and had an adjoining bathroom. I eyed the bed with interest. A sudden idea came to me. I may not have to leave Keeling tonight after all. The next room from the master stood with door ajar. This room was bare except for 9 mannequins, all covered in musty yellow sheets like the one at my house. I snapped a quick picture and shuddered, closing the door to the room. The next door in the hallway was closed. I opened it and stumbled back in surprise. This room had a child's bed and was filled wall to wall with dolls. I circled the room, curiously picking up a few. There was those Baby Alive dolls, Cabbage Patch dolls, and tons of creepy little yellowing porcelain dolls. They all appeared to be looking at the bed. I snapped 2 pictures in this room, vowing to come back with my Canon. I closed this door too, and entered the last room on the 2nd floor. It was a simple office that had green carpet and green wallpaper. It had a plain desk and tan typewriter, with a new white, not yellowed piece of paper loaded into it. I left this room and descended the stairs. It was time to bring out the big guns. I bent down to unsheath my cannon when a movement caught my eye to my right. I turned to look into the mirror. I had known it was there subconsciously, so what had caught my attention? I reached for my camera again, and I realized what was wrong. The mirror, more specifically my movements in it, were somehow out of sync. When I moved my arm, my reflection did so about a quarter second later. When I blinked, my eyes were still closed in the mirror when I opened them again. It was incredibly unsettling. I continued to watch my delayed reflection when I suddenly heard a noise, like the creaking of a stair. But it didn't come from the staircase on the right. It came from directly behind me, behind the basement door. Someone was coming up the stairs of the basement. So there was someone here. I eagerly gripped the basement door and tried to open it, but like the attic, it was locked. I banged on the door but only heard silence below. Ah, animals, of course. Still determined to find a story, I opened the front door to unload my car and stopped short. What the? My car which I had definitely parked at the top of the driveway, was now parked at the bottom, almost in the street. I had parked it at the top of the driveway, hadn't I? Maybe I'd just been excited. I couldn't remember. I unloaded the car and brought my stuff up to the master bedroom. As I walked by the sewing room, I noticed the door stood open again, but I knew I had closed it. I went to peer in, and this time, there were at least 14 sheeted mannequins in it. There had been 9 last time, right? I had counted. This time there were 5 more. Something was definitely going on. Perhaps it was all in my head. Maybe the air was toxic somehow, and that's why the government pushed everyone out of Keeling. Why was I losing it? I took another photo. By the time I deposited everything in the master bedroom, I was winded. I felt so weak. I had to lay down on the bed. This was unusual for me, someone who had nothing better to do most days than go to the gym. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, I heard someone with a high, small voice say bye-bye. I bolted upright and looked around in a panic, eventually noticing one of the dolls from the little girl's room sitting on the bedside table. It was small and porcelain. Since when did they make talking porcelain dolls? I rubbed my eyes and glanced around the room. In the muted light of the setting sun, I saw someone in the corner. Not someone, something. It was one of those stupid sheet-covered mannequins. I shuddered. That definitely wasn't there before. I walked over to it. Someone was fucking with me. I knew it. I started to raise the sheet to see underneath when I heard a loud bang from downstairs. I let the sheet drop and I started toward the bedroom door when I suddenly felt very sick. I dashed into the bathroom and threw up in the toilet. I wasn't going to have a lot of time here. Whatever was going on in this place, it was making me ill. I stood up from the toilet and splashed water on my face. This time, when I looked into the bathroom mirror, my reflection's movements were at least a half second behind mine. I waved my hands in front of the mirror, horrified by my reflection's slow response. I watched the blood leave my face as I gaped at my reflection in dismay. How was this even possible? Of course, it wasn't. What was going on in the house was, dare I say it, supernatural. Possibly. I mean, what scientific explanations were there? I wanted a story, and I had gotten one. I could be the first journalist to prove the existence of, what, ghosts, demons, poltergeists? I guess it didn't matter. It was my payday, and I was going to need evidence. As I turned away from the mirror to find my camera, I could have sworn I saw my reflection wink at me. I grabbed the Canon off the floor and began photographing everything I saw. I went downstairs to reshoot every room, starting with the library. I started pulling books out, one by one, and quickly realized that every single book in the library was a copy of the Bible. Many different versions and many different languages. I opened a few that were in English, and found that the word God was scratched out on every page, and every one. It was getting dark, and just as I thought about seeing if the lighting worked in this house, a light flicked on in the dining room, pouring out into the hallway. What the hell? I turned on my camera to photograph the corridor when I suddenly heard heavy stomping. It was more than stomping. It was almost running. It was coming down the hallway right towards me. I dropped the camera and stood frozen with fear. Whatever it was entered the library and stomped right up in front of me. I couldn't see anything, but there was definitely something there. I could feel it blocking me from leaving. I slowly pulled my phone out of my pocket and took a picture of whatever was right in front of me. The flash momentarily blinded me, and when I recovered my vision, all the books in the library were now on the floor, as if they had been ripped from the shelves in a rage, and in only that few seconds of silence. But I felt that whatever had been standing right in front of me was now gone. I picked up the Canon and took a few more pictures with shaky hands, and then tiptoed my way out of the room. I realized I needed video, not pictures. I pulled out my cell phone again and opened it up to video, Then I walked down the hallway toward the lit dining room. I passed a painting in the hallway and caught sight of my smirking reflection. As soon as I entered the dining room, I noticed something was different. A noose made of stained sheets was now tied to a beam above the table. It was swinging back and forth, as if it were weighted. Nothing else in the room was moving. Even the beam creaked as it swung, as if it too was straining from the weight of something. I filmed it for a minute, and then raised the Canon for a picture. It suddenly stopped swinging, as if someone had grabbed it in midair. I then heard giggling from upstairs. I left the dining room and walked toward the staircase. Did I really want to go up there? I didn't hear the giggling anymore, but I heard the typewriter clicking away. I happened to glance toward the large foyer mirror again to see that it was now out of sync a full second behind me. I heard the giggling again, and then something small run down the hallway and slam a bedroom door. On gut reaction alone, I threw open the door, intending to flee. My car was now 50 yards down the street. I was about to bolt for it anyway, when I heard another stair creak behind me through the basement door. This time it was closer, further up the stairs, maybe only 5 steps below the main floor. I shook my head, as if to shake it clear of fear. Every journalist dreams of a chance like this, of a story like this. I had to stay long enough to get something on video. I heard the typewriter start clicking again, and sprinted up the stairs, running full speed into the office. The typewriter had stopped typing by the time I got there. I ran over to see what had been written. I sat down at the desk when I reached it, suddenly feeling tired and weak again. The paper read, "Jamie Ellis is condemned. Jamie Ellis is condemned. Jamie Ellis is condemned." Over and over again, all the way down the page. I took a photo with the Canon and waited to see if it would start typing again. Just then, I heard a giggle echo down the hallway again. I rose from the chair and left the office, stepping out into the darkening hallway. The child's bedroom door was closed, but I could hear shuffling and movement from behind it. I slowly opened the door, hoping to find animals. Cats, raccoons, mice, anything. But it wasn't animals. Every doll in the room was where I had left it, only now all their heads were turned towards the door. They were all looking at me. I heard another giggle on my right and noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I quickly slammed the door shut and fell back against the banister in terror. I couldn't do this. I slowly got up, tired and shaky. I walked by the sewing room door. It was open again, and this time there were only 3 mannequins left in the room. I didn't stop to wonder where the others had gone. I bolted down the stairs as something ran up, stomping the entire way. I had been wrong, so wrong. It was time to leave. I needed to get out. I turned the front door handle and was sickened to find it locked. I ran down the hall through the living room and into the kitchen, pulling on the back door and screaming in frustration when it wouldn't open.
"Where you going?"
I heard from the living room. It was the dolls. Jesus Christ, those fucking dolls. I stumbled into the living room, which was now lit by a single tall black lamp in the corner. There was a doll on the floor in the middle of the room that I had never seen before. Knowing that my fate was probably already sealed, I walked over and picked her up off the floor. Her head hung limp, as any doll's would. "What did you say to me?" I breathed. "Nothing." "What the fuck did you just say to me?" I demanded in a crazed panic. The doll slowly picked up its head and smiled, breaking the stitching on its mouth.
"You're never leaving, Jamie. You're going to be just like me soon."
I screamed and threw the doll against the wall. The lamp went out, and I heard the doll run off into the darkness. I put my head between my knees, breathing hard now. This house was draining me. It was sucking the life right from me, just like the rest of the town. I was so tired. I walked out into the hallway to make my way to the foyer again to try the door. I dropped to my knees in agonizing fear when I saw a sheeted mannequin standing in the middle of the hallway, 15 feet away. Tears poured down my face as I noticed for the first time that this mannequin had legs and feet. Another doll. It was another human-sized doll. They were all dolls. Not knowing what else to do, I got to my feet and slowly raised the shaking camera to my eye. Peering through the viewfinder, I snapped the picture, and when I lowered the camera, I screamed. It was now right in front of me, and it was mumbling something unintelligible from under the sheet. I ran for my life, down the hall, and this time, I had no reflection in the mirror. I didn't even want to think about where my reflection had gone. As I took the stairs 2 at a time, I heard whatever it was on the basement stairs take another step up. It had to have been nearly at the top. I ran into the master bedroom, not daring to look into the sewing room on the way. I fell down onto the bed and shook with tears. I had such severe muscle weakness at this point, I could barely move. How was I going to escape this place? I raised my head to look out of the window for my car. I finally saw it. In the darkness, at the end of the street. I fell back to the bed, weak and sickly, and slowly slipped into unconsciousness. When I awoke again, it was with a start. Something was weighing me down to the bed. I shot up and noticed that I had been tucked under the covers and the entire quilt was covered in little dolls. There were so many of them, all sitting on top of the covers, trapping me there, looking in my direction. But the worst was at the end of the bed. There, leaning toward me over the footboard, was a mannequin. I watched in terror as the sheet slowly slipped off the mannequin. I fell out of the bed onto the floor. I heard the dolls giggling and laughing as I crawled my way out of the room. I didn't know where else to go. With the windows barred and the doors locked, the only way out seemed to be the small port window in the attic. I dragged myself up the stairs, hoping I had enough energy to throw myself against the door to break it in. I found it unlocked. I crawled into the attic and turned toward the window, my heart plummeting into my stomach. Oh, there was a port window, sure enough, but between it and I was a sea of dolls and mannequins. They all just stood there facing each other. There were hundreds of them. I moaned in defeated anguish, and in terrifying unison, every head slowly turned toward me. I recoiled in horror and fell down the attic stairs, hitting the second floor with a hard thud. The typewriter was clicking away again, but I already knew what it was typing. I stood up in utter pain and shuffled down the stairs. There had to be another way out. I wouldn't die here. I couldn't. All I'd wanted was my big break. What had I done to deserve all this? When I got to the bottom of the staircase, I dubiously turned to face the mirror. It was a half-second behind me again. I studied it, looking for some sign of weakness, something to tell me what was going on. I didn't know what else to do. Suddenly I heard a loud knocking on the basement door behind me and jumped. Oh God. Whatever it was, it had reached the top of the stairs. I spun around toward the door in a panic and dropped to my knees in my weakened state. I happened to glance under my arm and saw that, unlike me, my reflection had remained standing and facing me. I spun back to the mirror, but by the time I did, it was just a half-second behind me again. I leaned forward toward the mirror, watching it take a moment to follow. I even tried blinking, but by the time I opened up my eyes, its eyes were still open. My reflection suddenly sneered at me and slammed the glass with its fist from the other side. The glass cracked like a spider web, and I fell back in terror through the basement door that suddenly stood open. I felt every jolt, bump, and crack as I tumbled down the stairs, and when I finally came to rest at the bottom, I was in complete darkness. I tried to raise my head, but promptly passed out. This time when I came to, the room was well lit. I was lying on a concrete floor, on a dirty tan sheet, just like the mannequins standing around me wore. Other than them, there was nothing else in the basement except for a large portrait that hung on the wall. I got to my knees and stumbled over to it. The portrait was actually a mirror, or rather, was painted to look like a mirror of the room, and it was convincing. In the middle of the mirror stood a tall, dark-haired, solemn woman in a maroon dress. She looked almost familiar to me. Yes, it was her, Miss Harmon, a widow I used to see in town as a kid. But why was she dressed like she was in the 17th century? She had less wrinkles than I remembered as a kid, but had those same dark brown angry eyes. The portrait then blinked. I fell backwards into a mannequin, which somehow managed not to fall. It had regained its own balance somehow. I looked around the room. I turned back in horror to the painting to see the woman's face slowly curl into a smile. "Stay away from me!" I screamed at her and ran for the stairs. I pushed my way through the mannequins, feeling their hands grab my shirt, trying to pull me back. I took the stairs 3 at a time, and when I reached the top, I slammed the door behind me. My reflection was standing in the middle of the mirror, unmoving, watching me. I knew I couldn't get out of the front door. There was only one way out now. I dragged myself into the library and grabbed the first chair I stumbled over. Running back, I raised the chair to throw it into the mirror. In the second pause it hung over my head, I heard feet, pitter-patters, and loud thunderous steps running up the basement stairs and down the staircase to my right. I could see them all coming out of the corner of my eye, but I dared not look. I threw the chair full force against the mirror as my reflection continued to sneer at me. It shattered, and with my last ounce of strength, I stumbled into the black abyss on the other side. I heard the dolls follow, but I ran and ran, for hours it seemed, until I finally tripped over something and fell. I listened for footsteps, but there was nothing but silence. Looking up, I saw I was in the woods next to the house. There was nothing behind me or around me. I had no idea where I had just come from. I could see the house. It sat quiet and serene in front of me, but I knew better. Standing to my feet, I ran. I kept falling, almost succumbing to the darkness, but I pulled myself back up. I kept moving down the road, desperate to find my car. When I finally saw it on the moonlit horizon, I pulled the keys from my pocket and all but fell into the driver's side door. Not wasting a moment, I started the car and peeled off down the street. I drove as fast as I could out of Keeling, twice slamming on the brakes when I thought I saw a sheet-covered mannequin in my rearview mirror. I never returned to Keeling, or Missouri for that matter. At least, not physically. Even though my body escaped, I never did. I'm still there. Every time I sleep, or even close my eyes, I am back there, running from room to room. The dolls find new ways to surprise and terrify me every night. If I daydream, it's the same. I am only a hollow shell of who I was. My memories and my body is here, but my mind, my soul, is still in Keeling, trapped in that house. In case you're wondering, I escaped with my cannon around my neck, but all the pictures were empty, as black as the hole that was Keeling on Google Earth. Sometimes, even after I wake up in the night, I see a mannequin in the corner of my room. I know I'm in California, but I'm also in Keeling, in that house, at the same time. I have been condemned to it, and a part of me lives there. Every night in my dreams, the dolls try to pull me back into that basement. So far, I've resisted, but I can't hide forever. Someday, they will drag me back into the black abyss, and what awaits me there, I do not know.
Unfortunately, it's that hour of the night where we draw this evening's chilling festivities to an end with our last tale. Unit 522 knocked that story out of the proverbial park. My sympathies to any of you who once played with Barbie dolls and houses. With such malevolent mannequins and dolls, Barbie might just end up barbecued. And if all this upstairs haunting stuff has you worried, wait till I tell you a tale about what happened in my basement. My basement. I remember seeing the house for the first time. I was a child of 7. My young parents had just bought their first home. I remember how much I used to hate living in the cramped, dingy apartment we previously inhabited, and opened the doors to our new home with wide-eyed wonder. It blew my young mind how spacious this house was. I went upstairs to scope out my new bedroom. I was so excited that I was getting my own room and did not have to share one with my infant brother. On my grand tour of my new digs, I finally made it down to our basement. The basement was nothing like the rest of the house. The upstairs was elegant and classy. The basement was cold, metallic, sterile and stinky. The ceiling was lined with ancient pipes winding in grotesque angles. The floor was covered in rough cement. I recall taking a look at the stairs for the first time and being immediately struck with how odd they were. The stairs were surrounded by drywall which clashed with the rest of the basement. One particular section of the wall was colored differently than the rest. It stood out like a sore thumb. I inched close to it and felt the texture of it. It felt very strange. I then knocked on it. A hollow sound pervaded the empty air of that basement. Something about that sound immediately put me ill at ease. I walked up the stairs as I could hear that same hollow sound echo in the emptiness of the basement. As we settled into our new home, I began to get comfortable with my surroundings. The house began to feel familiar, everywhere that is, except for the basement. It just always put me off, and I avoided going down there as best I could. Our family couldn't be happier. My loving father and mother doted over me and my little brother. My life was perfect. Then it began. I would hear strange, errant noises. When I pointed it out to my parents, they told me the old standby, that the house was settling in. One night in particular indicated that something wasn't right. I snuck downstairs to the kitchen for a late-night snack. As I closed the refrigerator, I heard a tapping sound cut through the silence of the night. I craned my head to see if I could pinpoint where the sound was coming from. Dread began to wash over me as I realized that tapping was coming from the basement. I inched my way over to the basement door. I opened it to see the blackness of the depths below. My ears perked up. There it was again, that hollow tapping sound. The same sound I had heard on my initial visit to the basement from hitting the drywall. I turned on the lights, steeling myself to go down the stairs and investigate. The tapping continued as I took the first step. Fear overtook me. I ran back to my bedroom and hid under my covers until the morning light gave way to a new day. I remember walking down the stairs. Being the first one up and about, I ran to the living room to play Nintendo. On my way, I passed the door to the basement. It was shut. Though I was in a state of near panic when I ran from it the previous night, I distinctly remember leaving the door open and not turning off the lights. I rationalized that my mother or father must have gone down there for some reason and lost myself in Super Mario Bros. 3. Later, I mentioned the incident to my parents, and they just assured me that what I'd heard was the sound of the hot water heater clicking in the night. I knew better, but welcomed a logical explanation. About a month after the move, my mother asked me to run downstairs and grab a load of socks out of the dryer that were in the basement. I reluctantly told her I would. It was the middle of the day and enough time had passed to dull the fear I had felt the week prior. I turned on the lights. I ran down the stairs. Hearing the hollow sound echo with my footsteps, a cold sweat started to form on me. The smell hit my nose as I reached the last step. My parents had mentioned that a mouse must have died and assured me they would find it. I made my way to the dryer and grabbed a basket. I pulled the socks out hastily and shoved them into the basket. After I shut the door to the dryer, I surveyed my surroundings. The stillness of the basement was so eerie. Then I heard it. A faintly audible whisper. At first I thought it was somebody calling from upstairs, their voice scarcely making it down to the basement. However, this was not the case. That sound was coming from the basement, specifically from under the stairs. As I stood frozen with fear, it began to increase in volume, but still remained barely above the threshold of human perception. What was being said incomprehensible to my young ears. Then it stopped as quickly as it began. I moved towards the stairs, keeping my eye on the oddly colored portion of the drywall. As I took my first step to escape this ever-growing nightmare, the most profoundly terrifying moment of my life occurred. A loud, hollow banging shook the stairs, almost knocking me to the ground. I ran up the stairs as fast as my legs would carry me. Through tears and shaking uncontrollably, I told my parents what had happened. They tried their best to calm me, but nothing they said could ease my mind. I told them in no certain terms I would never go down to the basement again. They must have been convinced of how terrified I was, because they honored my request and never sent me down there again. After another 3 months in the house, things returned to normalcy for me. And honestly, there was about a 2-week period where I was happy again. This would be the last time happiness would exist in my life or my family's. One moment in particular comes to mind. I remember lifting up little Jonathan above my head as his pacifier fell out of his mouth and brushed against my nose. I pulled him in for a big bear hug and remember how he smelled. That wonderful smell that only babies emit. I was so content. It all came crashing down for me and my parents the night of July 2nd, 1991. That is the day Jonathan went missing. A ransom note was scrawled in barely legible English and left in his bed demanding $20,000 in cash. It informed my parents that if they contacted the police, they would kill little Jonathan. My mother and father took to their room and argued loudly and emotionally over whether or not to call the police, as I listened with tears streaming down my face. My mother eventually wore my father down, and the police were called. Seeing as the location of the drop and time were indicated on the note, the police set up a wiretap just in case the kidnapper decided to call. I remember asking my parents and the police if they had thoroughly searched through the house in case he was still there. They assured me they had, and that Jonathan would be fine after the drop. But the seed of an idea was already growing in my mind. It would blossom throughout the rest of my life. My parents followed the instructions to a T. They dropped off the money and then waited in the location that they were supposed to pick up Jonathan. He never came. Needless to say, this tore my family apart. As the weeks passed and there was no news about Jonathan, my young, vibrant parents became husks of their former selves. My mother especially. She blamed herself for getting the police involved and believed that to be the reason Jonathan was not returned. One night, as she was sobbing alone in shambles, clutching a bottle of wine, I finally decided to divulge to her the theory that had been brewing inside my skull. I told her that I thought it was whoever, or whatever for that matter, was under the stairs that had gotten Jonathan, and maybe he was still alive. She slapped me across my face so hard that I saw stars. She screamed at me, the guilt expressing itself as rage. She told me to stop the childish crap and just accept that Jonathan was taken out of the house by some sick person and was dead. My childhood died that day. I remember contemplating taking a hammer and exposing whatever was under the stairs myself, but the fear of childhood was just too overwhelming for me to actually do it, let alone step one stair down into that basement again. My family moved shortly after the incident. I remember looking to the future with what might resemble optimism, only to have it come crashing down yet again. My parents divorced. The grief was too much to share, and not a year after that my mother killed herself. The guilt must have just overwhelmed her. My father did his best to raise me, but Jonathan's long shadow always hung over our lives. 20 years later, I began to think long and hard about my little brother's disappearance and how angry it made me. My family had a chance at a normal and fulfilling life, and it was snuffed out in an instant by whoever took him. I wasn't just robbed of a little brother, I was robbed of a chance of happiness. As I grew up, I accepted the official story of what happened. But lately, curiosity began to get the better of me. I began to drive past the old house. Seeing that it was currently vacant, ideas began to swirl in my head. I broke into the house one night bolstered by alcohol. I decided to do it, knowing I would likely find nothing under the basement stairs, but hoping that this would close a too long chapter in my life and allow me to finally move on. To my dismay, the stairs sounded exactly the same as I remember they did. A hollow sound pervading the emptiness of the basement. I stared at the spot in the drywall, still discolored, still just as ominous as it was when I was a child. However, the fear was not going to stop me this time. In fact, I was feeling the opposite. I was feeling a courage I hadn't felt in a long time. The moment of truth was upon me. With all the force within me emboldened by years of pent-up rage, I ran towards the wall shoulder first. The drywall came crashing down around me. I opened my eyes as my bravery was immediately eroded and turned into absolute horror. My God! Bones. Bones everywhere. My horror increased to unimaginable heights as I surveyed the tight space, seeing the myriad of skeletons strewn about. The light played menacingly off their tiny white frames. Tattered pieces of paper were strewn about with God only knows what written on them. There must have been the remains of 20 or 30 children. My fright reached a crescendo when I realized that with no exceptions, they were all missing their skulls. One particular tiny skeleton begged for my attention. I became weak in the knees and fell backwards, when I saw what were unmistakably bite marks up and down the tiny forearm. As I hit the ground, I expected to hear a dull thud as I landed on the concrete. Instead, I heard a hollow sound. I looked to see what I had landed on. A trap door. Finding new courage, summoning strength I didn't know I had, I opened it. Below me lay a dark tunnel, a crawl space that could barely fit a person lying on their stomach. The dank smell wafting upward made me reluctant, but I knew what I had to do. Before I was conscious of what my muscles were doing, I found myself crawling through the darkness toward whatever lay on the other side. As I reached the end of the tunnel, I looked up to see a sliver of light cutting through the darkness. With trepidation, I pushed onwards. Cautiously, I poked my head up. To my surprise, the tunnel led to the other side of the stairs. I crawled out to find myself in the corner of the basement, facing the stairs behind a dryer covered in years of dust. The implications of all of this sent my mind reeling, but before I could form a coherent thought, the lights turned off in the basement. My heart caught in my throat as I began to hear someone descending the stairs. Slow but sure footsteps announcing I was no longer alone. With every thud, my heart skipped a beat. I began to hear that incomprehensible whispering, the familiarity reigning the fear and woe of my lost childhood. Worrying the darkness would not adequately hide me, I sought cover by ducking behind the dryer, not willing to take the risk of catching a glimpse, though every fiber of my being screamed to do so. Panic began to set in. What was I going to do when he, or it, discovered his lair had been revealed? While I was mulling over my options, the screaming began. I say scream as a frame of reference, but there is no way to truly describe the guttural noises I heard. The sound smashing the silence of the basement was so bone-chilling, so surreal as to defy description. He clearly had discovered his perverse sanctuary had been disturbed. Before I knew it, I was running up the stairs for my life. I made it to my car too scared to turn around. With all muscles working in concert, I opened the door and put the key into the ignition in one swift movement. As my car sprang to life under the street light, a shadow fell on my car. I gunned it, never once looking back, flooring the accelerator to the local police precinct. I breathlessly tried to explain to the attending officer what had occurred and collapsed onto the floor in mid-sentence. Now it is a month later. The next day after my discovery, the police launched an investigation and quickly made the same gruesome discovery as I had. I was thanked profusely by the police and the community for what I had found, telling me that they were going to be able to close the books on multiple missing person cases. However, they were not able to find the perpetrator of these heinous crimes. They began to test the DNA of the bodies. A profound sense of relief overcame me when I received a call informing me that one of the tiny skeletons belonged to my brother Jonathan. I shared the news with my father. The look of relief on his face tugged at my heart. The burden he had carried for so many years was lifted. We hugged as tears filled both our eyes. However, the relief has been short-lived. The thing that keeps me up at night is whoever or whatever did this is still out there. The question that plagues my mind is whether or not this monster is literal or figurative. Either way, I hope I will never find out. And that's it for tonight, friends. See you next time when we discuss everything from more creepy houses to H.P. Lovecraft, dark poetry and beyond. Make sure if you haven't already to subscribe to Dr. Creepin and Unit 522, as well as yours truly if you haven't already. And remember that here there is nothing but fear.